Welcome to episode 212 of the Urology Coding and Reimbursement podcast. I'm your host, Scott Painter, with my co-host, Mark Painter and Dr. Ray Painter. And on today's episode, we want to welcome back special guest, Dr. John Lynn. Dr. Lynn is for those of you who don't know him, is a solo practitioner in Gilbert, Arizona, and also one of our presenters in the Urology Advanced Coding and Reimbursement seminar. And John has contributed a lot of time to the podcast, and we really appreciate all that he does. He's also the manager or the founder of the Thriving Urology Practice Facebook group. And I'll let him explain that a little bit and share how to join that. But welcome, John, and let me just give a quick intro of today's episode. John, I think, and Mark was on the call, I think, as well, but had a discussion with a medical director of a payer, and he wants to share that experience with you all. So very interesting stuff, I think, that came out of it, and he's got a few nuggets to share with you. So with that, we want to welcome John. Thank you. Tell everybody how to join the Thriving Urology Practice Facebook group and a little bit about that, and then let's dive in.
All right. I like to tell everyone that I am the modern day Robin Hood. You see, I take from the information rich and give it to the time constrained poor. People like our listeners. And one of the ways I do that is through the Thriving Urology Practice Facebook group, where we crowdsource practice management solutions for everyone's benefit. And it is all for free. And as I say, if it's free, I'll take 3. So today's conversation it's very interesting. This is actually my 3rd conversation with this, shall we call this the largest private payer claims adjudicator. How's that? We'll just call it claims adjudicator in the United States that brings in about $100 billion to their entity annually. And it involves a urologist. And Mark and I were actually in attendance in support of this urologist because this urologist claims were being downcoded. Specifically, his 99204, level 4 new patient claims were downcoded to 99202 when he was seeing undesired fertility or vasectomy patients. When that is done the same day as a vasectomy, and he was also managing the patient's obesity and overweight. So that is the conundrum or the major reason for the meeting. And this meeting involved 9 of us. There were coders, claims specialists, the medical director, and the urologist in question, his office manager, Mark Painter, and myself. So that is the context of the meeting, and I have to give props to the office manager for bringing such a meeting together, because this is the 3rd meeting that she's put together, in-person meeting with coding specialists from this particular company, and then having advocates on the urologist's behalf. Mark, as you joined the meeting, what were your thoughts?
So, ultimately, so I missed one of the meetings that you guys had with this particular group, but, we'd had an argument previously on separate significant identifiable and the fact that modifier 25 was appropriate for
57.
57, right? For the decision for surgery. And we did end up coming to an agreement on 2 things at that point in time. One was that a vasectomy was a moderate risk procedure. 2, that undesired fertility fit best into a level 3 presenting problem, and that level 3 visit with a 57 modifier based on a broader discussion of the risks and benefits did support the billing of the 99203 or the 213 with a 57 and the vasectomy on the same date. And that, that was one argument that we had a couple of calls on. And this one, when, as John mentioned, was looking at the leveling of the E&M service. It was interesting for two reasons, I thought. One is they did not respect the management of the obesity, the second problem. But two, a new set of coders had actually changed the presenting problem from what we comparatively spoke of as an acute, uncomplicated, down to a minimal or self-limiting problem. So we did, they brought that all in with their coders, and then their medical director jumped on, and I spent a little bit of time talking about, hey, I thought we agreed on the three for the presenting problem. And then John did a fabulous job of talking through exactly why, when we went through the coding rules, we felt it was a chronic problem, not a treatment goal, and there was management and treatment there. Now, I mean, we did kind of see where they were thinking, and there are going to be some tweaks to documentation that are required, as again, we're kind of learning where their coders are thinking, but man, their coders really were the driving force, and John did a good job of really that one-on-one conversation of MD to MD in the medical director role, and it does show, I think, that given that conversation, that having a physician who understands, the coding rules, and John really was far more conversant in the rules of coding than the physician, who, in my opinion, was basically fed the company line based on what his coders had come up with, and talking him through exactly where those things were and getting him to understand, those rules. And from his medical perspective, there was definitely a shift throughout that. So well done, John. That was really, really impressive.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, the medical director was actually very reasonable, and it was great because everyone on the call knew the coding rules very, very well. So we didn't have to go back to the basics, despite the fact that their coders and coding specialists want to present their level 2, level 3, level 4 medical decision-making risk. We skipped all that. And this scheduled half-hour conversation turned into an hour and a half. So I have to give credit to the folks in this private payer adjudicator, which shall be nameless, just like Voldemort. So we will leave them anonymous, but I have to give them credit. They really knew what they're saying regarding the E&M rules. What is interesting is that, the medical director had no context regarding our conversation with this particular payer from 2 years ago. We had already agreed with their coders and billers that undesired fertility is not a self-limiting and minor problem, despite what this current set of coders and billers want to do. And I argued that this is truly, as you and PRS has advocated, that it's an acute, uncomplicated problem with undesired fertility. That is much to my great dismay, because I happen to do a lot of vasectomies, and no one's challenged me on this, but I happen to be the number one vasectomist in Arizona. So when the coding rules changed in 2021, that hurt financially. It took and you can find this video on YouTube, what used to be a 99204 visit down to a 99203, from a 4 to a 3. So in general, this is of course, you have to look at your particular claim encounter situation. In general, since 2021, a healthy male that you are seeing for undesired fertility is a 99203 in general. Keep that in mind, okay? Not always, in general. So that is to my great dismay. And what the the medical director initially started out was saying that this is actually a self-limited minor, and I was able to go back to the AMA definition, the American Medical Association's definition of what is it, acute uncomplicated. And Mark and I kind of said, well, we already discussed this. This as if this is, it's not law, but as if this is an IRS law that already has been ruled by the courts and there's case precedents. So we simply brought it back and said, we discussed this 2 years ago, and we all agreed with your coders that this is a level 3 problem. Level 3 problem. So we had to kind of reorient him. But I think initially we were all dancing around, not addressing the weight management issue. And he wasn't very, very clear in saying the weight management, how that plays in the overall level. And I had to reorient him and say, okay, let's get down to why we're here, is to talk about weight management and how that plays into the evaluation and management of this particular encounter. And these folks showed an actual encounter note by this urologist. And I will have to give it to them that the documentation was very Spartan. It wasn't a lot.
Right.
The work was done on weight management, but I agreed with the medical director that there was poor history and documentation. And according to the medical director, he would have liked to see something like a diet log or diet pattern or exercise level, alcohol consumption, medications under consideration, past weight history, comment on physical examination on the habitus of the body. And I brought the point that, yes, the patient can appear to be overweight on BMI, body mass index calculations, but that patient could be very muscular. I have seen several guys who are muscular, but their BMI is in the overweight range. So that I would not classify that as being overweight, even though the BMI qualifies them as being overweight. He wanted to see more documentation on the assessment of overweight and obesity. It's not simply listing, actually, overweight or obesity is not even listed on the encounter note. That's unfortunately how bad the documentation was. The medical director also would like to see, well, what else did you do? And initially he was saying that, interestingly, he said, maybe referring to somebody who deals with overweight and obesity, maybe nutritional counseling or seeing a specialist. And he was interestingly, he was willing to give credit to that referral, even though if you completely deferred the management of being overweight or obese, I would give the practitioner, the qualified healthcare professional, no credit. But he said, well, if you refer the patient and you close the loop, he's speaking from a primary care perspective, if you close the loop, then he would give the QHP credit for managing that problem. So that was an interesting aside. So the bottom line is, the work was done by the urologist regarding weight management, but there was horrible history taking and documentation, horrible documentation of examination. There was just a BMI calculated, no diagnosis listed in the encounter, even though that was on the claim going to the payer, but it was not documented in the EHR.
Now, John, one of the things that I found interesting in the early stages, and I'm kind of curious, is because unfortunately I had to drop and missed part of the very end. But there was a big focus on the fact that, the problem that you classify has to be clearly managed. Like, it's evaluation and management. And that was one of the other pieces that was kind of in the very beginning, where he was focused on that there was no real management, telling the guy that being overweight is bad, which was kind of the general gist of that, and that he should do something about it, wasn't really management. And I think that's part of what led him into, if you refer him, you push him, you close the loop so that there is management actually happening, then, and that can be demonstrated, then you can count the problem. So, and later on, we also got the pushback on the problem wasn't defined as well as it could have been with, was this guy really overweight or obese, as you mentioned? So it really was about that documentation, as we've constantly harped on all this stuff, that, you can't, and as much as we try and shorthand things, and try and make life easy, you absolutely must include, a good definition of a problem, and it does have to be managed in order to be counted. And so that was, I mean, they were, as you mentioned, they were following the rules within the parameters of the E&M guidelines, and they did rely heavily on definitions within the CPT manual. But it also showed me, as we had to re-argue the other point, that things change as people run through this. And man, they are, as much as the coding team over there, and I think in a lot of places, tries to say everything is black and white, or it's really well defined as a yes or a no. It's not. I mean, in the end, it is it is a subjective system, in a lot of ways, and ultimately that documentation that they're reviewing provides the color and the context, that really makes a difference in whether or not you can communicate the real level of activity and thought that goes into managing your patients.
Yeah, so the main thing is he wanted to see better documentation. And just to give you a little bit of context into how these folks think regarding what is separately billable. Let me play this clip for you.
It has to be separately identifiable. So if, like, I guess the way to explain it is, if you took away everything from your note that had to do with vasectomy, what remains would have to support weight management. Then it's separately identifiable. Because that's
So that's basically their thought process. If you strip away the documentation for that primary problem that you're dealing with, undesired fertility, what else is left? You strip the meat from the bone. The bone is, you have to be able to show that what you did regarding this overweight or obesity management is distinct and shows enough work effort on paper or in electronic form that warrants additional coding and billing.
Yeah. The other thing I'll add in all of this is, I do kind of wonder how that conversation would have gone without the medical director, in the conversation.
It did happen, actually.
Yeah.
So the first phone call or first Teams meeting, I was actually on a Mediterranean cruise. Thank goodness for technology. I was able to connect to the Teams meeting and get involved. And that's why this second meeting happened, because I kind of beat these coders back that they had to say, you know what, we need to regroup. And that's why the medical director came into play on the second Teams call.
Can you give a little more context on as to if somebody wants to have one of these meetings set up, how would they go about this? If they have, how did this happen and what was the sequence of events? You'd mentioned a couple calls 2 years ago, which was unrelated to this, but with the same provider or payer, but then this was a separate issue.
Yes, the initial meeting from 2 years ago was about whether or not undesired fertility evaluations is 99202 or 203. And we were able to establish that was a 99203. This second meeting and third meeting, which is actually dealing with one particular problem, is a separate but related issue. It's undesired fertility with management of obesity and morbid obesity, overweight, and how that is a higher code than a 99203. How the meetings were convened, I have to give credit to the office manager because I did not make them happen.
And were they talking a specific claim, or were they trying to lump them all together?
This is actually a group of claims. So the first meeting from they were downcoding to 99202 from 2 years ago. That would have cost this urologist on that set of claims tens of thousands of dollars. Now going forward, if you compound that, that would have been a lot more money, of course. And this actually the largest payer adjudicator, claims adjudicator in the United States, how things play out in these conversations applies to the entire cohort of claims that they manage, that they adjudicate. So it was important to me personally, and also is important to the urologist. Not only that, it's important to everyone in the urology space who performs vasectomies and deal with patients with undesired fertility.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it is pretty amazing that we've been able to have these meetings because of the office manager, the bulldog nature of just continuing to push and push for this, hats off to driving that conversation, into the mix. It was good. And yeah, again, it is one of those areas where I think you really did need the color commentary from both John and the medical director to bring the coding team around. I mean, they couldn't answer John, but in the first, it had to regroup. But I don't know that they would have changed. I think if we hadn't had the medical director on to actually agree to the reality of medical care, and what could happen in the process. They're just slow on the uptake of the clinical side. That's really, I think, more difficult for them to grasp. I think they generally understand it, but that is not, they just didn't have the context. So, that the other piece of that I would add into the mix is, when you get into a situation where you really feel that you are in the right medically, that peer-to-peer conversation, and we've seen this across the board, is where you can win some coverage battles. So, that hopefully most of the time you won't have to do this, and you lay down the groundwork, and hopefully those things are taken forward. But it's important to not give up, and it's important to leverage the physician patient clinical side of the equation in all of this, as well. I mean, it's important in that process to get that understanding fully across.
The medical director, most of the conversation was actually between myself and the medical director, which is great. And it's important in these discussions to frame things in a positive interaction and not an adversarial interaction. So from the very, very beginning of the discussion, as soon as everyone got on, I said, hey, I'm looking forward to a productive meeting. And at the end of the discussion, how we ended up, the final disposition, how it was favorable for the urologist, he texted me and said, John, are you sure you were not a lawyer in a past life? So that was a huge compliment. A good lawyer is not argumentative. A good lawyer is agreeable and finding common ground, which is how I framed the discussion. And Mark, like you said, understanding the rules of coding and billing and being able to apply them in context is very, very important. These coders coding specialist and the medical director were saying that weight management, it could be a time-based billing like a 99401 through 99404, which is not what this urologist is doing, but he is simply just saying that obesity and overweight and managing it that way in evaluation and management for that particular encounter, concurrent with a undesired fertility and vasectomy evaluation. They were arguing that obesity and overweight is not a chronic problem. And I had to go back to this AMA definition and say, well, this is a chronic problem, not a treatment goal. And they were trying to say this is a chronic stable problem or an acute uncomplicated problem. And I said to the coder, and I asked the medical director, when have you seen anyone that walked into your door who gained weight overnight? And he conceded that, no, actually, most people gain weight slowly. And so I was able to clearly demonstrate to everyone that obesity, overweight is a chronic problem, not a treatment goal, which would put it at level 4 risk, level 4 risk. And vasectomy procedure itself is a level 4 problem. And if you're billing based on medical decision making, which I encourage everyone to do in the urology space because it is much more efficient and much easier on you, you just need 2 of the 3 elements to reach a level. So when you have a level 4 problem, overweight, obesity that you're managing, and you're performing a vasectomy, level 4 risk, at 4 and a 4 yields a 99204. So I was able to finally get him to accept that obesity management is a level 4 risk. And this is how it sounded like.
Yeah. From a coding standpoint, yeah, if you document all that, it does meet AMA that if it's, I'll concede it. If it's poorly controlled, it could be considered, that's how they define a chronic illness with exacerbation, progression, or side effects, even if it's not progressing, if it's just poorly controlled.
Boy, I really appreciate this amazingly thorough and intelligent conversation regarding E&M coding. Again, you want to couch things in a positive way. And when you find a common ground, find an agreement, praise that, support that. They were pushing for a level 3 problem for obesity and overweight, but I was able to apply the AMA definition. Now, if they simply read the AMA definition, it would have said acutely worsening, poorly controlled, progressing chronic illness, intent to control progression, requiring additional supportive care, attention to side effects, consideration of hospitalization is not required. It may not be perfectly applicable to the situation, but when you are able to put things in context and taking the intent of this particular level of code regarding this problem, then it would be applicable to this current situation. And that's how we're able to get them to concede, if you will, that obesity management, overweight management is a level 4 risk, because level 4 problem, because it is a chronic problem, not a treatment goal, which is a level 4 problem. And for those who are not familiar, it is your treatment goal. You as a qualified healthcare professional, typically urologist or APP, it's your treatment goal. If it is not at your treatment goal, then it is a level 4 problem, moderate risk problem.
Did the medical director, you had mentioned at one point, the medical director said that when you're managing that obesity, to kick it back or to send it to the primary care, was that discussed further, that a urologist should be, doing this obesity, this weight management, versus a primary care? Was that part of that?
No, that's a great question, actually. We did discuss, I try to push for exactly what do you want as far as weight management? What kind of things do you want to see? And he did mention about diet history, how the patient has been managing the weight, et cetera, some sort of documentation. I think all he wants to see is some sort of documentation instead of nothing, as shown in that particular example encounter. He wanted to see something documented regarding weight management. He was actually very lenient. If you referred the patient out for weight management, he was willing to give you credit, depending on context, if you will. He was willing to give you credit because he was a former primary care doctor. So he was willing to give you credit, even if you refer the patient to somebody else, if you are still managing the overall problem and the patient's coming back to you. But I was able to finally get him to say that, yes, counseling, which is what I do, which is what this particular urologist did, counseling is a form of management. The problem is, for this particular urologist whose claim was being downcoded, the documentation was extremely poor. So how do we end up finishing the conversation? Well, this is what it sounds like.
So for now, I am okay with paying these at 99203 if these are resubmitted, as if they are within the time frame to do that, or appeal, and then if you can improve the documentation to show that a separately identifiable evaluation and management service for weight management was provided, then that would be paid also.
That's a huge win. That I was ecstatic when I heard that. So what ultimately ended up happening is that this urologist is now able to go back and amend his prior encounters where his claims are downcoded and then get that brought up to a level 4. I was able to get this particular payer claims adjudicator to agree to our position because we backed our argument based on AMA definition, based on application of the actual CPT rules.
That is awesome.
Yeah. And yeah, go ahead, Ray.
I think you're muted.
Muted.
John, there's several coding principles that you discussed here that I think it'd be important to unpack and look at separately. And what you think the coders are going to look at in future claims from this particular payer. First is, it sounds like you succeeded in getting them to agree that obesity would be a level 4. So that's good. The other thing is, in this particular case, we're talking about an additional problem, chronic problem, not a treatment goal, in addition to your vasectomy. Do you think they have agreed that, yes, if you've got the documentation accurate, that they would pay it at a level 4?
And that's exactly what that medical director said in the last audio clip that I played. Yes. He said, if it's just a straightforward undesired fertility, it's a 99203. And if there's documentation and listing of the problem and management, evaluation and management of that problem relative to obesity, then he would give a level 4 for that encounter.
I think that's key for everybody listening.
So I'll add a little more color on this. So John, basically the argument that you used has been the one we've talked about forever. And you're right. I mean, if you look at basically the summary of rules of what a moderate presenting problem with in the table that's in the CPT manual, it doesn't say chronic treatment or chronic condition, not a treatment goal. Actually explicitly. Where it does say that is in the definition down below in the explanation, And it actually is fairly clear. And they give an example that of chronic condition, not a treatment goal. For example, a patient with persistent, poorly controlled blood pressure for whom better control is a goal is not stable. Even if the pressures are not changing and the patient is asymptomatic, the risk of morbidity without treatment is significant. And that's really that basis of the obesity being a problem. That will lead to problems down the road. And so that definition is kind of where I think they landed, it sounds like, on making sure that BMI wasn't just the driver to say this guy has obesity, not a treatment goal. So and my understanding was they wanted a little bit better categorization that this patient was in fact obese, and these were potentially big problems for the patient down the road, and they needed to control it so that you were both managing and dealing with that particular problem that could turn into something bigger. So keep that in mind when you're dealing with your documentation. And then Ray, you're bringing up the point that if we just had the obesity plus the counseling, that wouldn't have supported a 4, right?
Yeah, correct.
We needed both the fact that we were managing the obesity and managing this guy's consideration of permanent sterility for his undesired fertility. So it wasn't just about explaining the risks and benefits and heading him in to get a vasectomy because he'd already made up his mind. It was a discussion and management of what your options are and do you want to go forward with this, which is management of that particular problem, plus the obesity, the fact that it really is a problem, a health problem that needs to be managed, and what should that be done. So you've got one problem that was, stable or not the chronic, not a treatment goal, one that was an acute, uncomplicated, but the risk of the other actually brought the two up. So you've got to have both. That separate discussion about vasectomy, which was our first argument, not just here's the risks and benefits, let's go, and the management of the definition and management of that chronic problem of obesity.
Yeah, it can be pretty complicated. And let me just bring this, let me land this plane. Okay, in general, I'm talking in generalities. Of course, every encounter is contextual to your particular visit. In general, an undesired fertility evaluation and concurrent vasectomy on the same day is a level 3 visit, modifier 57, plus the CPT code for vasectomy. Now, if that same patient for whom you're seeing for undesired fertility and you all decide to do a vasectomy on the same day, and the qualified healthcare professional, typically the urologist, is also managing, for instance, he notices that the patient is overweight, obese, and he is managing that obesity and overweight in the form of counseling. If you do both the undesired fertility evaluation and management of the obesity, overweight, morbid obesity, and you perform a vasectomy on the same day, that's a 99204 plus the CPT code for vasectomy. Of course, you use a modifier 57 on the E&M code.
Awesome. Well, that was excellent, John. Really appreciate sharing that story and going through that, walking us through that. What a lot of interesting points there and a lot of interesting takeaway points. So let's wrap this thing up. Get some final thoughts, and let's start with Mark. Final thoughts.
So again, as we've harped on millions and millions of times, well, maybe not millions, but it feels like millions. Documentation is key. I mean, it's got to be able to support what you're doing, and it's got to support the medical side of what you're doing as well. So It needs to be medically necessary, but supported. And so pay attention to those nuances, if you will. But in the end, I think the other thing you can take away from this, and the way John kind of was on the land the plane side of the equation, is this doesn't. It's not like you have to run through this every single time in your head. You should be able, with the amount of work that you do and the type of patients that you see, to think about these buckets of patients and what that documentation needs to support, so that the variability from patient to patient can really drive the level of service relatively easily. So, it's kind of like learning math problems or all these other things, that there is a certain amount of this that it can become second nature if you practice with good foundational education. And you might as well lean into the fact that, I mean, these are things that we cover on the podcast, but also things that we have deep discussions on at the Urology Coding and Reimbursement seminar, both in December and in January. So join us for a few more of these. That would be great to have everybody else in there.
Ray, final thoughts.
Well, there are several additional things that we need to keep in mind as we document. And John, Mark, congratulations. I think it's huge that you got them to agree that a chronic problem is one that is not at treatment goals. And I hope they put this throughout their coding community. And so I think that's huge. And documentation, as we always talk about, is key. Now, in your lawyer capacity, John, I wonder, is there any way that we could codify this, like a letter to United saying, this is what I agree that we do, what I understood that we discussed, or something like that? Because they need something to pass down from coder to coder and generation to generation.
Yeah, that I do not know if there's a way that we could write a letter and say, hey, this is what you all agreed on. But hopefully the listening audience will be able to go back and maybe have the payer listen to this conversation and say, hey, this is what we'd agreed on, and we've already, as if you will, case law. This is now case law that there is precedent that you can hang your hat on. So hopefully this gives the practitioner and the coders and billers some ammunition on how to appropriately code and bill for undesired fertility evaluation and management of obesity and overweight.
Well, speaking of case law, when I was early in the game of this, before I really got involved in a lot of the speaking and so forth, I had a patient that there was a procedure done and then a second procedure, which they bundled, but in his particular case, it shouldn't have been bundled. And he was willing to take them on. So with his assistance, we went up through all the different adjudications and made it to the judge. And I got a verdict in our favor. And I thought I'd changed the world, only to find out I'd only changed that one claim. So hopefully this will change and go up the chain of United.
I doubt it, but at least you have something to go on. I guess it's just kind of like the administrative law judge decision on disputed Medicare claims. They don't look at case law. They don't look at precedent. Every claim, every discussion is judged based on the merit of that particular case, unfortunately.
And that's my point.
Yeah.
That's what Medicare does, and it doesn't provide case law.
No.
All right,
Which is a
John,
shame.
final thoughts.
Ray, I'll let you finish.
I said, and that's a shame.
Yeah, it is a shame. Okay, I'll conclude with this. Information or education without execution is purely entertainment. You must not only have the knowledge, but also how to apply that knowledge. And for the urologist, it's kind of like a patient with BPH. You know the treatment options, but which is the best or the right treatment option for the patient requires a thorough understanding of the patient and situation, and also the tools at your disposal. That selection is often straightforward and guideline based, kind of like coding. There are some rules and guidelines and definitions. But choosing that option sometimes requires you to break the rules and do what's right for the patient. Likewise, for private payers, when dealing with this coding and billing issue, you often have to use unconventional rules that don't adhere to NCCI or National Correct Coding Initiative edits or CPT guidelines to get your claims paid, because private payers often do not follow them. Now, Scott, where can someone interested in learning more on how to win this coding game get additional training to do this better?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, John. We are having, as Mark mentioned as well, our annual Urology Advanced Coding and Reimbursement Seminar in Las Vegas, December 6th and 7th, and in New Orleans at the end of January, beginning of February, January 31st, February 2nd, February 1st. And we encourage you all to join us. It's a 2-day intensive seminar, and we talk about these issues. And what we really are trying to help you with is how to make sure that you're paid accurately for all the services you provide. The work that you provide, that doctors and practitioners and APPs provide, is super important, and all that needs to be compensated at the rate that they've agreed to. And many times it comes down to knowing the rules, knowing how to document for reimbursement. So there is a big difference between documentation for clinical malpractice. You got to sprinkle in those reimbursement words so that it makes sense to the coders and that the payers out there. So come join us at the seminars. And Mark is going to be there. John's going to be there. I'm going to be there. Ray's going to be there. We all are going to be there. And we're going to hear you got to learn from the experts. And these are the experts in urology. So go to if you want to sign up, you can go to prsnetwork.com/212. There's links to the sign up and the registration for the seminar. We hope to see you all there.
And let's not forget Marianne DeSoyce, the billing director for PRS Network, who manages a ton of coders and billers, will also be there. She's an amazing speaker, an invaluable source of information from the trenches, and she often brings up-to-date information regarding coding, billing. For instance, how to navigate G2211. And for the urology practices that are not using G2211, you're leaving money on the table. This is the kind of information that you need to learn, and you will learn at these meetings. Back to you, Scott.
All right. Yes, and we hope to see you all there. Well, once we do want to thank ModMed for supporting this episode. You can go to modmed.com/PRS Network for specials for our listening audience. That's all we have for today. Thank you all for listening. Take us out, John.
Happy coding, everyone.